January 20th, 2008, 9 o'clock in the morning. The house should have been quiet. Not the kind of quiet that makes your stomach tighten. Not the kind that feels wrong. Just the ordinary silence of exhausted college students sleeping off a long night. Instead, something felt off. A young woman stepped into the living room of the rental house near the University of Nevada campus, expecting to find her friend exactly where she had left her only a few hours earlier, curled beneath a blanket, fast asleep on the couch. The couch was empty. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Maybe she had gone home. Maybe she had stepped out. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Then her eyes moved around the room, and nothing made sense. A pair of shoes sat neatly on the floor. Her purse remained untouched. Her wallet was still inside. Her keys hadn't moved. Her cell phone sat nearby, fully charged, silent, waiting for a call that would never come. Everything Brianna Denison needed to leave was still there. Everything except Brianna. A strange feeling crept through the room. The kind that arrives before your mind catches up to what your instincts already know. Something wasn't right. Then she noticed a pillow, a small stain, dark, almost hidden against the fabric. She walked closer. The stain looked like blood. For a moment, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. How does someone disappear without taking their phone? How does someone walk out into a freezing Nevada morning without shoes, without a jacket, without a purse, without telling anyone? None of it fit, and every second that passed made the silence heavier. Outside, Reno was waking up to another winter morning. Students were grabbing coffee. Cars were filling the roads. Parents were getting ready for work. Nobody knew that somewhere in the city, a 19-year-old college student had vanished under circumstances so disturbing they would soon terrify an entire community. The 911 call came quickly. The words rushed out through panic. A friend was gone. There was blood on a pillow. Nothing else made sense. Police officers arrived within minutes. At first glance, the scene looked almost ordinary. No shattered windows. No broken furniture. No overturned lamps. No obvious signs of violence. The living room appeared frozen in time, as though Brianna had simply stood up and disappeared into thin air. Yet investigators couldn't ignore what was sitting directly in front of them. The shoes, the purse, the phone, the blood. Every item seemed to be telling the same story. She hadn't left willingly. And then there was another question, perhaps the most chilling one of all. How had this happened inside a house full of people? Friends had been sleeping only a few feet away. Nobody reported hearing a scream. Nobody heard a struggle. Nobody heard footsteps. No crashing furniture. No desperate cry for help. Nothing. It was as if someone had entered the house, stolen a sleeping young woman from the couch, and vanished back into the darkness without making a sound. The possibility seemed impossible, until investigators examined one small detail near the entrance. A detail so unsettling that the entire case instantly transformed from a missing person investigation into something far darker. Because what they found suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't random. And somewhere beyond that front door, a predator was already becoming more dangerous. The blood on the pillow was troubling. The disappearance was worse. But neither was what truly frightened investigators. That moment came inside a laboratory, because the evidence recovered from the house wasn't just evidence. It was a message, one that suggested Brianna Denison's disappearance wasn't the beginning of a nightmare. It was the next chapter. Crime scene technicians carefully processed every inch of the house. The pillow, the living room, the doorway, the furniture, anything that might reveal who had entered the home while everyone slept. Then they found it. Touch DNA. Microscopic traces left behind on the rear door. Nothing dramatic. No handwritten confession. No clear fingerprint. Just invisible biological evidence left by a person who likely believed he had slipped through the darkness unnoticed. The sample was rushed for analysis. Investigators waited, and when the results came back, the room reportedly went cold. The DNA wasn't unknown. Not entirely. It matched evidence already sitting inside police files. Files connected to a series of terrifying attacks that had been haunting the Reno area for months. Suddenly, Brianna's disappearance no longer looked like an isolated abduction. Detectives were staring at something much larger, something far more dangerous. A predator, one who had already attacked before. The realization spread quickly through the investigation. The same DNA profile had surfaced in previous sexual assault cases near the University of Nevada campus. Young women, college age, attacked within a relatively small geographic area. Different victims, different nights, same offender. The pattern was impossible to ignore. For months, police had been hunting an unidentified man who appeared to know the area intimately. A man who struck quickly. A man who vanished before anyone could stop him. A man who seemed to grow more confident with every attack. And now that same DNA had appeared inside the house where Brianna disappeared. The implications were horrifying. Because if the evidence was correct, investigators weren't searching for a kidnapper. They were searching for a serial predator, one whose behavior was escalating. The timeline only made the fear worse. The attacks had occurred within the same general area surrounding the university. The victims shared similar characteristics. The geography overlapped. The offender seemed comfortable operating there, almost as if the neighborhood itself belonged to him, as if he knew every shortcut, every dark corner, every vulnerable target. Questions multiplied faster than answers. How long had he been watching these streets? How many times had he passed unnoticed among students and residents? Had he been selecting victims randomly, or had he been studying them? And perhaps most disturbing of all, had Brianna specifically caught his attention? The more detectives examined the pattern, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't the behavior of someone acting impulsively. There was patience here, control, planning. The offender wasn't simply attacking opportunities. He appeared to be refining a process, learning from each crime, improving with every encounter. The possibility terrified investigators because serial predators rarely move backward. They escalate, and if that pattern held true, Brianna might represent something far worse than another victim. She might represent the moment the predator crossed a line he had been approaching for months. Across Reno, fear began spreading beyond law enforcement. Most residents still didn't know the details, but detectives understood something the public didn't. A dangerous offender had been operating in plain sight, and despite multiple attacks, he was still free, still walking the same streets, still blending into everyday life, still hunting. Then investigators uncovered another detail hidden inside the earlier cases. A detail so disturbing it would reveal something deeply personal about the man they were chasing. Something that transformed him from a violent criminal into something far more frightening. Because wherever he attacked, something always disappeared with him. And it wasn't by accident. Continuing directly from Section 2, the items that disappeared weren't valuable. Not in any traditional sense. Money was left behind. Electronics remained untouched. Yet after several attacks, victims reported something strangely specific missing. Pieces of intimate clothing, personal items, objects with no financial value whatsoever. To investigators, it was an unsettling clue. To criminal profilers, it was something else entirely. A window into the offender's mind. Because predators who keep trophies are often preserving something far more important than the object itself. They're preserving the memory, the power, the reliving of a moment that continues long after crime is over. And the more detectives looked backward, the more disturbing the pattern became. Months before Brianna vanished, another young woman had endured a terrifying encounter. October. The semester was in full swing. Students filled classrooms, dormitories, coffee shops, and late-night study sessions. Life felt normal, safe, predictable. For one woman, that illusion shattered in an instant. A stranger emerged from the darkness and attacked. The assault was sudden, calculated, terrifyingly controlled. The victim survived. Physically, emotionally, the damage would linger far longer. At the time, investigators believed they were dealing with a dangerous offender. Nothing more. No one yet understood they were witnessing the opening move of something much worse. Weeks later, it happened again. November, another young woman, another attack, another encounter with a man who seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. This time detectives noticed something unsettling. The offender appeared more confident, more organized, more willing to take risks. Predators often evolve. Each successful crime teaches them something. What works, what doesn't, how far they can go before getting caught. And this offender was learning fast. The attacks weren't random explosions of violence. They felt rehearsed, refined, as though each victim was teaching him how to become more dangerous. By December, investigators were no longer looking at isolated incidents. They were studying a progression, and that progression was accelerating. The December attack terrified detectives for a different reason. The offender didn't simply assault his victim. He exerted greater control, greater domination, greater confidence. The violence was escalating. The risk-taking was increasing. The psychological barriers that stopped most people from committing horrific acts appeared to be dissolving. One by one, crime by crime, the pattern raised a frightening possibility. What if sexual assault was never the final destination? What if these crimes were steps, practice runs, rehearsals, preparations for something darker? Criminal psychologists often describe escalation as a process rather than an event. Fantasy becomes behavior. Behavior becomes confidence. Confidence becomes obsession. And obsession rarely remains satisfied. The trophies added another layer to the mystery. Why keep them? Why risk preserving evidence? Why carry reminders of crimes that could send you to prison forever? Because for some offenders, the crime doesn't end when they leave the scene. It follows them home, lives inside their thoughts, returns during quiet moments. The stolen items become keys, unlocking memories they never want to forget. Investigators began to suspect they weren't hunting a man driven purely by impulse. They were hunting someone consumed by fantasy, someone replaying his attacks long after they ended, someone whose appetite appeared to be growing. And if that theory was correct, a terrifying question emerged. What happens when fantasy is no longer enough? The answer may have arrived just days later. Because while detectives worked to connect the earlier assaults, another young woman was living her life completely unaware that she was moving toward a collision course with a predator. 19-year-old Brianna Denison wasn't thinking about serial offenders. She wasn't thinking about danger. She wasn't thinking about becoming the center of a statewide manhunt. She was thinking about friends, family, school, the future. Only 24 hours after the predator's most recent failed attack, their paths would cross, and nothing would ever be the same. To understand why Brianna's disappearance devastated so many people, you have to understand who she was before she became a headline, before the search parties, before the television coverage, before her face appeared on missing person posters across Nevada. She was simply Brianna, a teenager standing at the beginning of her adult life, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make it feel brighter. Friends described her as warm and compassionate, the sort of person who genuinely cared about other people, not because she had to, because that was who she was. She dreamed of helping others. Studying psychology fascinated her. She wanted to understand people, to support them, to make a difference. Her future felt wide open. The possibilities seemed endless. To her family, Brianna wasn't just a daughter. She was a source of energy, a source of laughter, a source of love. The bonds she shared with those closest to her were strong. And like most families, they assumed there would be countless years ahead. More birthdays, more graduations, more memories waiting to be made. Nobody imagines the clock is already running out. Winter break had brought Brianna back to Reno. Classes were temporarily behind her. Responsibilities had loosened. Like many college students, she was enjoying time with friends before returning to campus life. The weekend felt ordinary, comfortably ordinary, and that would later become one of the most painful parts of the story. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. There were no warning signs, no ominous feeling hanging in the air, just young people enjoying a night together. Music, conversations, laughter, the simple moments that rarely seem important until they're gone forever. At some point during the evening, Brianna and her friends attended a concert. Photos captured smiles. Memories were created. Nobody looking at those images could have known. They were documenting some of the final carefree hours of her life. Afterward, The group continued spending time together. The night stretched on. A casino visit. More conversations. More laughter. Nothing remarkable. Nothing memorable enough to stand out. The kind of night people experience every weekend, which is precisely why it became unforgettable. As the hours grew later, exhaustion began settling in. Friends started deciding where they would sleep, who would drive home, who would stay. The practical decisions that come at the end of every long night. Brianna exchanged messages, made plans, talked with people she loved. There was every expectation that tomorrow would arrive exactly as it always had. Another ordinary day. Another step toward the future she was building. Sometime before dawn, she decided to stay at her friend's house. The choice seemed insignificant, a matter of convenience, a place to rest before heading home. The living room couch became her bed for the night. A blanket, a pillow, a familiar environment surrounded by friends. Safe, or at least it appeared safe. Yet one question would haunt investigators for years. Was someone already watching? Had the predator seen her earlier that evening? Did he know she would be there? Or was this the result of pure opportunity? The truth remained hidden somewhere in the darkness. What is known is that while Brianna drifted into sleep, believing the hardest part of her night was over, another person was awake, moving, watching, thinking. A man whose fantasies had been escalating for months. A man growing increasingly confident. A man who was about to make the most catastrophic decision of his life. And somewhere beyond the walls of that quiet house, he was already hunting. The house was full of people. That's what makes what happened next feel almost impossible. Several young adults slept inside, bedrooms occupied, hallways quiet. The ordinary sound of a home at rest. Breathing, silence, dreams. And somewhere among them, Brianna slept on the couch, completely unaware that danger was moving closer with every passing minute. At some point during the early morning darkness, an exterior door remained unlocked, a simple detail, one countless people overlook every day. For investigators reconstructing the crime, that unlocked door became the gateway through which a nightmare entered. No one knows the exact second he arrived. No surveillance cameras captured his approach. No witness saw him enter. Only the evidence remained, the fragments left behind, the silent story told by forensic clues. Investigators believe the intruder moved carefully, purposefully, not like a burglar searching for valuables, not like someone acting impulsively, like a predator entering territory he had already imagined countless times. The darkness helped him. The sleeping occupants helped him. Every quiet room became another layer of protection. Step by step, he moved deeper into the house, past people who never realized they were sharing the same air as a predator, past bedrooms where friends slept only feet away, past opportunities to panic, past opportunities to turn back, until he reached the couch. And Brianna, what happened in those moments remains one of the most haunting parts of the case. Did she wake immediately? Did she understand what was happening? Did she think she was dreaming? Investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct those missing minutes. The blood found on the pillow suggested resistance. Evidence indicated she was alive when she was taken. Alive, conscious, terrified. The realization was devastating, because it meant Brianna likely experienced a horror of understanding that she was being removed from the safety of the house, removed from the people who could have helped her. Yet somehow, nobody woke up. No screams echoed through the hallway. No frantic pounding on doors. No sound dramatic enough to alert the sleeping occupants. Only silence. A silence that still feels almost impossible. For detectives, that silence became another mystery layered on top of the kidnapping itself. How does someone enter a crowded home, abduct a young woman, and leave without triggering chaos? The answer pointed toward planning, control, experience. Traits investigators had already begun recognizing in the unknown offender. By sunrise, the intruder was gone. The house appeared normal. The city continued moving. Traffic flowed. Businesses opened. Coffee shops filled with customers. And somewhere out there, Brianna was gone. When friends finally realized she was missing, the nightmare truly began. Within hours, police were mobilizing. Search efforts expanded. News spread. Questions multiplied. The disappearance transformed from a confusing mystery into a race against time, because every investigator understood the same terrifying reality. If Brianna had been taken alive, every minute mattered, every hour mattered, every delay mattered. And as Reno woke to the news that a college student had vanished without a trace, thousands of people found themselves asking the same question. Where was Brianna Denison? What nobody knew yet was that the answer would take 26 agonizing days to uncover. And before those days were over, an entire city would learn just how fragile hope can be. I'll rewrite Section 4 as a fully cinematic documentary segment that flows naturally from Section 3 and focuses on emotional attachment before the tragedy. Long before her name appeared on missing person posters. Long before reporters stood outside police headquarters. Long before strangers across Nevada would learn her story. Brianna Denison was simply a 19-year-old college student trying to figure out her future. The kind of future most people take for granted. Classes, friendships, relationships, career plans. The thousand small moments that eventually become a life. People who knew Brianna often describe her as someone who made others feel comfortable almost immediately. She wasn't the loudest person in every room. She didn't need to be. There was a warmth about her that drew people in. She loved being around friends, loved laughing, loved feeling connected. And like many young adults standing at the edge of independence, she was excited about everything that still lay ahead. She had dreams, plans, goals she hadn't yet reached. A future she was still building one day at a time. To her family, she wasn't a headline or a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a source of joy, the person who called home, the person whose presence made holidays feel complete, the person whose chair at the table was never supposed to be empty. In January 2008, winter break offered a brief pause from the responsibilities of college life. Classes could wait. Assignments could wait. For a little while, there was only freedom, time with friends, late nights, memories in the making. The weekend began like countless others. No warning signs, no sense of danger, nothing to suggest the next 24 hours would permanently alter dozens of lives. As evening settled over Reno, Brianna joined friends for a night out. There was music, energy, the excitement that fills crowded venues when young people gather with nowhere important to be the next morning. For a few hours, life was uncomplicated. Photos captured smiles. Conversations drifted between friends. Laughter echoed through the night. The images that survive from that evening are difficult to look at now, not because anything appears wrong, because everything appears right. A young woman enjoying her life, a future still intact. After the concert, the night continued. Nobody seemed eager for it to end. The group eventually made their way to a casino. Lights flashed. Machines chimed. Crowds moved through the building. The atmosphere felt ordinary, comfortably ordinary. Looking back, investigators would later wonder whether someone saw Brianna that night, whether a predator's eyes ever landed on her in a crowd full of strangers, whether the encounter that destroyed her future began hours earlier than anyone realized. No evidence ever answered that question, but the possibility lingers, because predators often watch before they act, observe before they approach, study before they strike. As the night grew later, exhaustion slowly replaced excitement. Plans shifted. Friends discussed where they would stay, who was driving home, who wasn't. The small practical conversations that happened at the end of every long night. Brianna exchanged messages, talked with people she cared about, made plans that assumed tomorrow would arrive. Because why wouldn't it? 19-year-olds aren't supposed to think about mortality. They're supposed to think about next week, next semester, next year. Eventually, Brianna decided to stay at a friend's house rather than head home. It seemed like the easiest option, the safest option. A familiar environment surrounded by people she trusted. Nothing about the decision felt significant. No crossroads, no dramatic choice. Just a tired young woman choosing a place to sleep. The couch in the living room became her bed for the night. A pillow, a blanket, the quiet comfort of knowing friends were only a few rooms away. Security, normalcy, safety. At least that's how it appeared. Outside, Reno settled into the cold darkness of early morning. Traffic faded. Neighborhoods grew quiet. Lights switched off one by one. Inside the house, people drifted into sleep, and Brianna closed her eyes believing the night was over. What she couldn't know was that somewhere nearby, another person remained awake. A man whose violent fantasies had been growing for months. A man who had already crossed lines most people could never imagine crossing. A man becoming increasingly confident with every crime. The distance between them was shrinking, minute by minute, street by street, thought by thought. And while Brianna slept peacefully on that couch, unaware of the danger moving toward her, a predator was already hunting. By sunrise, one of them would still be in control. The other would simply be gone. Sometime before dawn, the house fell completely silent. The kind of silence that exists only in the deepest hours of the night. No conversations, no television, no footsteps, just darkness settling over sleeping rooms. Inside the house, several people slept peacefully, some behind closed bedroom doors, others only a few feet away from the living room, close enough to hear a shout, close enough to hear a struggle, close enough, it would seem, to stop a crime. And yet none of them knew a predator was moving toward them. Investigators would later piece together the most likely sequence of events using forensic evidence, witness statements, and behavioral analysis. The exact minute remains unknown. The exact second impossible to determine. But at some point during those early morning hours, someone approached the house. Someone who appeared comfortable operating in darkness. Someone who had done something very similar before. The rear door was unlocked. A simple oversight. A detail so small it would later haunt everyone connected to the case. The intruder didn't need to break a window, didn't need to force a lock, didn't need to create noise. He simply entered, one quiet step at a time. No alarm sounded, no dogs barked, no one stirred. The house accepted him without resistance. Investigators believe he moved with purpose, not like a burglar searching room to room, not like a panicked criminal acting on impulse. His behavior suggested something colder, more deliberate, as though he already knew exactly where he was going, as though the objective had been chosen before he ever touched the door. He moved deeper into the darkness, past sleeping occupants, past closed doors, past countless opportunities to abandon whatever plan had brought him there. Each step increased the risk. Each step increased the possibility of being discovered. Yet he continued. That confidence troubled investigators. Most criminals fear being caught. This man seemed willing to gamble, willing to move through an occupied home where a single unexpected sound could trigger chaos. What gave him that confidence? Experience? Practice? Or something even more disturbing? Eventually, he reached the living room, and there she was, Brianna, asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, completely unaware that the most dangerous person she would ever encounter was standing only feet away. For a moment, investigators wondered if he watched her first, whether he stood there silently, studying her, making decisions, preparing himself. The truth remains locked inside the mind of the man responsible. What happened next can only be partially reconstructed. Evidence suggests Brianna woke up. At some point, she became aware that something was terribly wrong. The blood discovered on the pillow would later support that theory. A small stain, easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore, because it suggested resistance. It suggested fear. It suggested that Brianna fought, even if only briefly, even if only for a moment. One terrifying question has haunted this case from the beginning. Why did anyone hear her? The house wasn't empty. Friends were sleeping nearby, some only a short distance away. Yet nobody reported screams. Nobody described a violent struggle. Nobody remembered hearing anything unusual. The silence became one of the greatest mysteries in the entire investigation. Perhaps shock prevented her from reacting immediately. Perhaps threats were made. Perhaps events unfolded too quickly. Investigators could never know with certainty. What they did know was devastating. Brianna was taken alive. Alive when she left the house. Alive when she disappeared into the darkness. Alive when every chance of rescue still existed. Outside, the cold Nevada air waited. The streets were empty, the city asleep, And somewhere beyond that doorway, the predator's plan continued. Where did he take her? How far did they travel? What happened during those missing hours? The answers remained hidden, locked behind the same darkness that swallowed Brianna that morning. By sunrise, the intruder had vanished. The evidence left behind was minimal. A few traces, a few clues, fragments of a nightmare. Inside the house, everything appeared almost normal. The couch remained. The blanket remained. Her belongings remained. Only Brianna was missing. At first glance, it looked impossible, as if a human being had simply dissolved into thin air. But reality was far worse, because somewhere in Reno, a predator was awake. A predator who had successfully entered an occupied home, successfully abducted a young woman, successfully escaped. And as the first calls of police began arriving, the scale of the horror started becoming clear. Friends panicked. Families received devastating news. Officers rushed to piece together what had happened. Hour by hour, concern turned into fear. Fear turned into urgency. And urgency spread across the city, because a young woman had vanished without explanation. No witnesses. No clear suspect. No obvious trail. Just an empty couch and a growing realization that something terrible had occurred. As daylight spread across Reno, thousands of people began their normal routines. They drove to work, attended classes, ran errands, completely unaware that one of the largest searches in Nevada history was about to begin. And somewhere beyond the city limits, hidden from view, the answer everyone desperately needed was already waiting. The nightmare had only just begun. The first day was fueled by urgency, the second by determination. By the third, something far heavier had settled over Reno. Fear, not the loud, chaotic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that follows you home, the kind that makes parents check locks twice before bed. Because Brianna Denison hadn't simply gone missing. She had vanished. And with every passing hour, the odds of finding her alive grew smaller. Police worked around the clock. Detectives chased every lead, every rumor, every possible sighting, any fragment of information that might point them toward a frightened 19-year-old somewhere waiting to be rescued. The problem was that nobody knew where to begin. There was no vehicle description, no eyewitness account, no security footage showing what happened. Just a young woman who had gone to sleep on a couch and disappeared before sunrise. The mystery itself became part of the terror. How do you search for someone when you don't even know where they were taken? For Brianna's family, sitting still was an option. Every interview became a plea. Every camera became an opportunity. Every microphone became a lifeline. They appeared on television, spoke to reporters, asked strangers for help, desperately trying to believe that somewhere Brianna might see the coverage herself, might hear their voices, might know they were looking. Hope became its own form of survival, because the alternative was unbearable. Across Reno, volunteers began organizing search efforts. People who had never met Brianna showed up anyway. Students, parents, neighbors, entire groups of strangers willing to spend their weekends searching fields, roadsides, vacant lots, and abandoned areas. Some carried maps. Others carried photographs. Everyone carried the same question. Where is Brianna? Search teams expanded outward day after day. Areas were checked, then checked again. The landscape slowly transformed into a giant puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The FBI joined the investigation. Resources increased. Experts became involved. The case was no longer simply a local missing person investigation. It had become something much larger, something attracting attention far beyond Nevada. Television stations across the country began covering Brianna's disappearance. Her photograph appeared everywhere. News broadcasts, newspapers, internet forums, missing person bulletins. Millions of people who had never heard her name suddenly knew her face. And still, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No breakthrough evidence. No phone calls leading detectives to the answers they desperately needed. Only more uncertainty. As the days stretched into weeks, symbols of support appeared throughout the city. Blue ribbons, messages of encouragement, handmade signs, community gatherings. The public refused to let Brianna become just another case file. People wanted her found, wanted her home, wanted the nightmare to end. Thousands of tips flooded investigators. Every one of them carried potential. Every one demanded attention. A reported sighting in another city, a suspicious vehicle, a possible suspect, a woman who looked like Brianna, a rumor overheard at a gas station, a story told by a stranger. Detectives followed them all, one by one, and one by one they collapsed. False lead, dead end, mistaken identity. Nothing. Hope would surge, then disappear. Again and again. The emotional toll became enormous. Each promising lead created new expectations. Each failure deepened the despair. Yet the search continued, because as long as Brianna hadn't been found, there was still a possibility, however small, however fragile, that she was alive. At night, investigators often found themselves wrestling with another question, one they rarely spoke aloud. Was a man responsible watching all of this? Watching the news coverage? Watching volunteers search? Watching Brianna's family beg for answers? Predators often insert themselves into investigations psychologically, reliving the crime, following media reports, taking satisfaction from the chaos they create. Nobody knew whether the offender was doing exactly that, but the possibility haunted investigators. Even more frightening was another thought. If this man had successfully abducted Brianna, what was stopping him from trying again? The fear wasn't limited to one missing woman anymore. It had become fear of an unseen predator still walking free, still hidden, still unidentified. Day 26 arrived. Winter still gripped Nevada. Snow covered large portions of the landscape. The search had become exhausting, emotionally draining, yet it continued, because nobody was ready to stop looking. That afternoon, in an industrial area outside Reno, a worker noticed something unusual against the white snow. At first it seemed insignificant, just a flash of color, a small patch of bright orange standing out against an otherwise frozen landscape. The worker looked again, then moved closer, and in that moment, 26 days of hope began colliding with a reality far more devastating than anyone had imagined. Here's Section 7 in the same cinematic documentary style. For 26 days, hope had survived, bruised, exhausted, fading, but still alive. Every morning, Brianna's family woke up believing that today might finally be the day the phone rings with good news. Today might be the day she comes home. Today might be the day this nightmare ends. Instead, on February 15th, 2008, the nightmare changed shape. It became real. The industrial area sat on the outskirts of Reno. Cold, quiet, forgotten. The kind of place people pass without noticing. Snow covered much of the ground, turning the landscape into a blank white canvas stretching toward the horizon. That afternoon, a worker was moving through the area when something caught his attention. A flash of color. Bright, out of place, orange, against the endless white snow. It stood out immediately. At first, it didn't seem important. Just debris, discarded clothing, trash carried by the wind. The worker looked away, then looked back. Something felt wrong. The object wasn't moving, wasn't buried. It appeared attached to something larger, something partially concealed beneath the snow. The closer he moved, the worse the feeling became. And then the truth emerged. A human body, partially exposed, lying alone in the frozen landscape. The worker immediately contacted authorities. Within minutes, police vehicles began arriving. Then more. The area was secured. Crime scene tape stretched across the snow. Investigators stepped carefully through the field. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but many already suspected who they had found. 26 days. 26 days without answers. 26 days without a single confirmed sighting. 26 days of desperate hope. And now, a body had appeared. The discovery site sat miles away from the house where Brianna vanished. Miles away from the couch where she had fallen asleep. Miles away from the people who loved her. Detectives worked carefully, methodically, documenting every detail, every footprint, every piece of evidence, every possible clue left behind by the person responsible. The bright orange socks became impossible to ignore. In photographs of the recovery scene, they stood out against the snow like a cruel marker, the first visible sign that the search was over. As investigators gathered evidence, another process quietly began: identification. Families of missing persons understand this moment better than anyone. The terrible space between possibility and certainty. The moment when you know the answer is coming. You just don't know whether your heart can survive hearing it. Authorities moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. The body belonged to Brianna Denison, 19 years old, daughter, friend, student, the young woman whose face had stared out from television screens and missing person posters across the country. The young woman thousands of strangers had searched for. The young woman everyone desperately wanted to save. Now she was gone. Somewhere, investigators made phone calls they never wanted to make. Somewhere, family members received news capable of changing a life forever. No amount of preparation makes that moment easier. No amount of hope softens the impact. The search parties ended. The posters suddenly felt different. The prayers changed, because this was no longer a rescue mission. It was a homicide investigation. The emotional weight settled over Reno almost immediately. For weeks, people had imagined Brianna alive somewhere, waiting, fighting, surviving. Now that possibility was gone. Only grief remained. Yet even as investigators processed the scene, another mystery emerged. The location itself raised questions. Why bring her here? Why leave her in an industrial field? Why expose the body at all? Predators who successfully hide victims often continue hiding them. Something about this decision felt different, intentional, almost careless, or perhaps confident. And investigators weren't finished uncovering disturbing truths. Not even close. Because once the autopsy began, medical examiners discovered details that transformed the case yet again. Details that revealed the killer's behavior was even darker than detectives had imagined. And among the evidence recovered, there was one item that didn't belong to Brianna at all. An item that suggested there may have been other victims investigators didn't even know about yet. The discovery of Brianna's body ended one search, but it began a far more disturbing investigation, because now detectives were no longer asking where she was. They were asking what happened during the 26 days she was missing. The answers would reveal a predator far more dangerous than anyone initially understood. When medical examiners began their work, they weren't simply documenting a homicide. They were attempting to reconstruct the final chapter of Brianna's life. Every injury, every piece of evidence, every biological trace, every detail mattered. Some findings confirmed investigators' fears. Others introduced entirely new horrors. The examination revealed that Brianna had been murdered by strangulation. It was an intensely personal method of killing, not distant, not accidental. Strangulation requires proximity, control, time. The killer had been close enough to hear breathing, close enough to feel resistance, close enough to watch life disappear. For criminal profilers, that mattered, because strangulation often tells investigators something about the offender's psychology. It isn't simply about eliminating a witness. It's about domination, power, control over another human being, the kind of control certain predators crave above everything else. As disturbing as that finding was, another discovery proved even more shocking. Among the evidence associated with the crime scene were women's undergarments that did not appear to belong exclusively to Brianna. Investigators immediately recognized the significance. This wasn't random. This wasn't an afterthought. This was behavioral, intentional, a potential trophy. The same disturbing pattern detectives had begun noticing in earlier attacks. The same pattern hidden inside reports from previous victims. The same pattern suggesting the offender wasn't simply committing crimes. He was collecting memories, preserving them, reliving them. The realization sent investigators back through every connected case, every assault, every report, every surviving victim. The questions became darker. Who owned the additional items? Another known victim? Someone who never reported an attack? Someone investigators hadn't even identified yet? Nobody knew, and that uncertainty terrified them, because trophy-taking offenders often reveal only a fraction of their crimes. The evidence discovered may represent known victims, or it may represent victims who never came forward, victims who survived, Victims who disappeared from the offender's life, but never disappeared from his mind. Behavioral experts began constructing a psychological profile. What emerged was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a man acting in sudden bursts of violence. This wasn't a spontaneous predator, making reckless decisions. The behavior suggested ritual, fantasy, repetition. Certain elements appeared important to him, beyond the actual crime itself. The stalking, the control, the trophies, the preservation of memories. Each component seemed connected to an internal fantasy world that had likely been developing for years. Investigators increasingly believed they were dealing with a serial predator whose crimes had evolved over time. Someone who rehearsed mentally. Someone who revisited his offenses long afterward. Someone who was becoming more dangerous. The possibility raised another frightening question. Had Brianna been the intended destination all along? Or was she simply the victim who happened to be present when the offender's fantasies escalated to murder? No one could answer. Yet one thing seemed increasingly clear. The progression from assault to abduction to homicide wasn't random. It resembled escalation. The gradual expansion of confidence that often appears in violent serial offenders. Each successful crime teaching them they can go further, take greater risks, exercise greater control, and survive. For investigators, that realization carried an urgent implication. If the killer remained free, there was no guarantee Brianna would be the last victim. He had already demonstrated a willingness to escalate. What would stop him from doing it again? The public knew only fragments of these developments. Detectives kept critical details private. They needed information only the killer would know. They needed leverage. They needed mistakes. Most of all, they needed a suspect. But weeks turned into months. The headlines slowly faded. The searches ended. The community grieved. And still, the predator remained invisible. No arrest, no confession, no breakthrough. Only a growing stack of evidence pointing toward a monster whose name investigators still didn't know. Somewhere, that man continued living his life, working, driving, talking to neighbors, appearing ordinary, perhaps even following news coverage about the case, knowing that police were searching for him, knowing they were getting closer. Then, just when an investigation seemed trapped in place, a phone rang. An anonymous caller had information, and what she revealed would change everything. The phone rang just after midnight. No caller ID, no name, just silence on the line, followed by a voice that didn't sound like it belonged to someone asking for attention. It sounded like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "I can't keep this to myself anymore," the woman said. Then she hung up. Detectives tried to trace the call immediately, but the signal was already gone. What remained was a single sentence that would fracture the entire direction of the investigation, because the caller didn't give theories. She gave something far more dangerous. A location, a truck, and a man. At first, it sounded like noise. Another tip, another emotional dead end in a case already buried under false leads. But something about her voice didn't sit right with the investigator, listening to the recording on repeat. There was no hesitation. No guessing, only certainty wrapped in fear. Within hours, detectives found her. She wasn't a witness in the traditional sense. She wasn't someone searching for attention or closure. She was connected in a far more intimate way. She was the suspect's girlfriend. And what she revealed next didn't just expand the case. It cracked it open. She told them about the truck. Not just any truck, but one she had ridden in, sat in, lived around. A vehicle that had always carried an odd tension she couldn't explain at the time. She described small details first. The smell that never quite went away. The way certain areas were never cleaned. The locked compartments he insisted she never touch. Then came the moment she hesitated. The pause that told investigators they were getting closer to something buried. She mentioned finding clothing. Women's underwear. Not hers. Folded. Hidden. Not discarded like trash, but stored like something meant to be kept, something meant to be remembered. The room went still as she described the realization forming slowly in her mind. At first, she convinced herself there was an explanation, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But memory has a way of reshaping itself once fear enters it. And now, sitting in front of detectives, she could no longer unsee what she had seen. The truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a pattern, a moving container of secrets. Investigators moved fast. Surveillance photos, traffic records, vehicle matches, and then the break they've been waiting for, but almost stopped believing would come. A match. Same make, same model, same subtle modifications she had described without even realizing their importance. A dent on the rear panel, a custom seat cover, a detail so small most people would ignore it, but now it connected everything. And just as they locked onto the vehicle, something unexpected happened. It vanished. The truck was gone. Not abandoned. Not parked. Gone. Records showed a sudden departure from Reno. No clear destination. No filed route. Just movement. Fast and deliberate. As if the moment he sensed pressure tightening, he erased himself from the map entirely. It wasn't panic. It was experience. And that realization shifted everything again. Because this wasn't a man reacting for the first time. This was someone who had done it before. Investigators widened the net instantly. Financial trails, phone pings, associated names. Every connection fed into one narrowing funnel until a pattern emerged so consistent it couldn't be ignored. One name kept appearing, not as a witness, not as a background figure, but at the center of overlapping timelines, overlapping locations, and now overlapping fear. A suspect who had stayed just far enough in the spotlight to avoid being consumed by it. Until now, detectives prepared the next step carefully. Interviews were scheduled, warrants reviewed, pressure building silently behind closed doors. Then came the moment they finally confronted him. They expected denial, confusion, maybe even anger. Instead, they got something colder. He refused to provide DNA. No explanation. No justification. Just a flat rejection delivered with the calm of someone who understood exactly what that refusal would imply. In that instant, the investigation stopped feeling like a search and started feeling like a race. Because refusal wasn't neutrality. It was a signal. And for the first time since the case began, investigators weren't asking if they were close anymore. They were asking how much time they had left before he disappeared again. The man they were now circling had never presented himself as a mystery. To everyone around him, he looked structured, controlled, predictable, the kind of person you trust without thinking twice. He had served in the military, not as a headline, not as a story he told loudly, but as a quiet credential that explained his discipline, his obedience, his ability to follow systems and remain calm under pressure. Those who knew him during that period described someone efficient, emotionless when it mattered, focused in a way that made him reliable in environments where hesitation could cost lives. But investigators understood something else now. The same training that made him dependable also made him dangerous. Because discipline, when detached from empathy, doesn't disappear. It evolves. After leaving the military, he didn't drift. He transitioned cleanly into construction work. Another environment built on structure, heavy tools, controlled access, temporary spaces that appear and disappear depending on project timelines. And that was where the pattern began to sharpen. Construction sites gave him movement without suspicion. Uniforms gave him camouflage. Authority gave him access. No one questions a man in a hard hat carrying tools. No one questions why he's there late, or early, or alone. But what investigators would later reconstruct wasn't just opportunity. It was rehearsal. Each job site expanded his understanding of space, blind spots, security routines, human behavior when people assume they are safe. And slowly, without anyone noticing, he was learning how invisible he could become inside plain sight. Then came something even more disturbing. Campus access. Not as a student, not as staff, but as a contractor moving through systems designed to trust credentials over instinct. Universities are built on openness, movement, flow, people coming and going without question, and he moved through them freely. At first, investigators thought it was coincidence, job assignments, routine contracts. But when they overlaid timelines, something unsettling emerged. His presence consistently aligned with periods of vulnerability, Late nights, low traffic, transitional shifts, times when people were alone, times when surveillance attention naturally drifted, and that is when the pattern stopped looking accidental. It started looking rehearsed. Then came the surveillance gaps, the blind spots in camera coverage he seemed to understand too well, moments where he appeared and disappeared in ways that suggested familiarity with infrastructure most people never study. He didn't avoid cameras randomly. He avoided predictable patterns, which told investigators something critical. He wasn't guessing. He was observing and learning. But what truly changed the tone of the entire investigation was what they found next: his violent history, not always documented in official systems, not always prosecuted, but present in fragments, reports that never fully connected at the time, complaints that were dismissed, incidents that didn't escalate far enough to form a complete picture. Until now, when placed together, those fragments formed a trajectory, not of chaos, but escalation. Each incident slightly more controlled, slightly more invasive, slightly closer to something he was building toward. And then came the most disturbing layer: the trophies. Items recovered during searches that had no functional purpose. Objects that weren't valuable, weren't necessary, weren't accidental. They were kept, stored, hidden, not as souvenirs in the traditional sense, but as confirmations, proofs, anchors to memory. Investigators described them not as objects of obsession, but as evidence of reinforcement. Each item representing a moment he had crossed a boundary and discovered he could live beyond it. That realization reframed everything, because this wasn't impulsive violence. This was conditioning, a mindset shaped by repetition. Escalation wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism. And once that mechanism was understood, one question became impossible to ignore. Why did he escalate? Was it control? Was it compulsion? Or was it something even more difficult to confront? The possibility that escalation itself had become the goal? The psychological profile built by investigators painted a chilling structure. A man who tested limits not to break them all at once, but to see how far they could stretch without snapping. Each boundary crossed without consequence reinforced the next. Each silence from authorities reinforced permission. Each moment of escape reinforced confidence. And confidence, in a mind like this, doesn't stay stable. It grows until it demands more, which led investigators to a second question they could no longer avoid. Would he have killed again? Nothing in the evidence suggested he was stopping. Every behavioral marker pointed in the opposite direction: mobility increasing, risk tolerance expanding, surveillance awareness sharpening. The pattern wasn't concluding. It was accelerating. And then came the turning point no one inside the investigation expected to happen so quickly. He was brought in, not as a suspect in theory, but as a man finally contained in reality. The interrogation room was quiet, almost ordinary, which made everything inside it feel sharper. He sat across from investigators with the same calm he had shown from the beginning. No visible panic, no cracks in posture, only stillness. But stillness, they realized, was not absence of fear. It was control. When asked about evidence, he offered nothing. When confronted with patterns, he denied connection. When pressed about locations, he redirected. And when DNA was requested again, he refused. Completely, without hesitation. That refusal changed the atmosphere instantly, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic, as if he understood the legal weight of that single decision better than anyone in the room. And that is when the case shifted from investigation to consequence, from theory to confrontation. Because no matter how carefully a mind is built to hide in plain sight, there comes a moment when containment is no longer enough. Now the survivors would have to face him where the system demands truth. In court, the courtroom felt smaller than it should have. Not physically, but emotionally, like the air itself had thickened around every seat, every breath, every silent expectation. Families filled the benches. Reporters lined the edges. Survivors sat closer than they ever wanted to sit to the man they had spent months trying not to picture in their sleep. And at the center of it all, he sat motionless. The same composure, the same stillness, the same unreadable face that investigators had learned to distrust more than any outburst, because silence, in his case, had never meant innocence. It had meant control. The prosecution didn't begin with drama. It began with structure, step by step, timeline by timeline, a slow tightening of a net that had once been invisible but now felt unavoidable. They walked the jury through the vehicle, the matches, the surveillance patterns, the locations that overlapped like a map drawn by someone who believed they would never be traced. And then they brought in the evidence that shifted everything from theory to certainty. DNA, clean, undeniable, scientific in a way that stripped away argument, stripped away doubt, stripped away every carefully constructed alternative explanation the defense could attempt to build. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It simply confirmed. He was there, and that fact, once established, could not be erased by denial. But the courtroom didn't fully break until the survivors spoke. One by one, they stepped forward. Their voices weren't theatrical. They weren't exaggerated for impact. They were quiet in a way that made them more powerful than any argument the attorneys could deliver. One survivor described the moment she realized she had been followed. Another described the silence of the room after she escaped what she couldn't fully bring herself to name. Another spoke not about violence, but about absence, the way normal life fractures when you realize how close danger had been to becoming permanent. And every testimony carried the same emotional weight beneath it. Not just what happened, but what almost happened. The courtroom didn't react loudly. It didn't need to. The tension shifted in subtle ways. Hands tightening, breath slowing, eyes refusing to look directly at the defendant for too long. Even the jury began to change in posture, as if their bodies were learning the truth before their minds fully processed it. When the defense spoke, they tried to frame him differently. Procedural doubt, questioning interpretation, challenging certainty. But the structure they were trying to dismantle had already been reinforced too many times. Every layer of evidence pointed in the same direction. Every inconsistency resolved itself into the same conclusion. And when the prosecution finally rested, there was no uncertainty left to feed on, only accountability. The verdict came after what felt like an endless silence. Guilty. The word didn't echo dramatically. It landed heavily, like something that had been expected for so long it no longer needed explanation. But for the families in that room, it still carried the force of finality. Some closed their eyes. Some exhaled for the first time in hours. Some simply stared forward, trying to understand what justice actually feels like when it finally arrives. Then came sentencing. Death penalty. The judge's voice remained steady, but the impact inside the room was anything but neutral. It marked the legal system's ultimate conclusion to the case, but not the emotional one, because justice, in moments like this, is never clean. It resolves the legal question, but it never fully resolves the human one. Outside the courtroom, something else began to take shape. Brianna's law, a legislative response born not from statistics, but from grief that refused to remain private. Her family, instead of retreating into silence, chose to transform loss into structure, into prevention, into something that could outlive the tragedy that created it. It wasn't easy, it wasn't immediate, and it wasn't symbolic. It was fought for, and slowly, it began to change how systems responded to risk, to missing persons, to early warning signals that might have once been ignored. But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't in legislation or verdicts. It was in the people left behind. Survivors who learned to speak again. Families who learned to live with absence without letting it define them completely. Investigators who carried the case not as a victory, but as a reminder of what happens when warning signs are almost missed. And in the quiet aftermath of everything, the evidence, the trial, the sentence, one truth remained heavier than all the others. A predator walked through an unlocked door and stole a future. But the evidence he left behind would ultimately expose every mask he wore. And because Brianna Denison's family refused to stop fighting, thousands of future victims may never have to suffer the same fate.